Skin soft and body warm. The pulse rather fast. Her hands are small and thin, but the fingers quite flexible. The body emaciated. Parts of her are almost ice cold. Her eyes and cheeks are sunken. However, she doesn't have that paleness, not that heavy dew which betokens death. But something is wrong. Something is not right. Welcome to Extraordinary Stories podcast. Hey, how are you? Are you well? Are you good? I am. So, here we are. A new story to tell. Now, whilst I cook up the second transformation episode, I have this one bonkers tale to tell. And a bonkers tale it is indeed. So thank you for everyone who got in touch about the transformation episode that was up recently. Lots of lovely things. And of course, some corrections, because it would be really unusual if I could get through an entire episode and not have made some mistakes. So, apparently, I said Oscar Wilde was from England, when in fact it's a well-known fact he's actually from Ireland. So, I feel sorry for you if you believed me when I said he was from England. That's your fault, not mine. Yeah, okay. Here we are. It's February, which means, Valentine's Day coming up soon. I'll await with anticipation the many Valentine's cards I will get from everyone at my Extraordinary Stories P.O. box. That's a bit old school now. I don't know. Do people still? No, I think people do still send cards and things, don't they? I'm not sure. Maybe it's all electronic these days. I'm not sure. Anyway, let's get on with the story. Are you ready? Okay. Let's go. So this story begins many, many years ago. We're in 1859 and we're in the UK. Buckinghamshire. Buckinghamshire. Someone in England, help me out, because it's not necessarily easy to say Buckinghamshire. I think that's how you say it. Now, there is a little village called Turville, and in this time period, it was quite scarcely populated, and farming was the kind of main industry of the time. So in Turville, we have the Sadler family, and that is Mother Anne Sadler and her, frankly, bananas, 12 children. 12 kids! Okay then. She had two of those kids, like the oldest ones were two daughters, and they helped out with the raising of the younger kids, the many thousands of children that she had. Now the kids all had jobs. They did things like they helped out in neighbouring farms. They worked in shops nearby. They did their bit for the family home. The Sadlers were a very, very poor family. Now, they lived in a fairly modest but quite picturesque, quite pretty little cottage, all 14 of them. Now, that's Anne, her 12 children, and so who is number 14? Well, that's Thomas Fruin, and that's Anne's husband, but not the father of any of the children. So, after child number 12 had been born and was still a baby, Anne's husband died, sadly, and she was left alone with 12 kids. It was then she met Thomas Frew and they got married. So there is one child in particular we will focus on and who this whole story is about. Although, oddly, she is the main character, but she does the least. You will see what I mean. Ellen Sadler was child number 10. And she, was what could only be described as a curious child. Of all the kids, young Ellen was the one who gave her mother Anne the most trouble. And now, not in the way that you might think. Ellen wasn't a troublemaker. She wasn't cheeky. She wasn't disruptive or loud. In fact, Ellen was the opposite. She was very quiet. Very, very quiet. And always had been. As a child of about 4 or 5 years old, it really troubled Anne that her daughter wouldn't play with her siblings when they were, playing games or running around the cottage, chasing each other, being kids, basically. Ellen wasn't to be found doing this. Instead, she preferred solitude. And often, what she would do is just spend time in her part of the bedroom that she shared with her sisters, just staring out of the window. Now, there's debate around her being just quite a dreamy child, or was there something wrong? Some people would describe Ellen as listless, sedate. Other people said she simply wasn't in a rush and that she preferred to think rather than to do. I mean, I can kind of see where people are coming from, but then, I don't know. I mean, I think it's pretty... Not all kids are kids who charge about all over the place making lots of noise. You do, get lots of quiet children. I was not one of those. I can assure you. I was not a child who sat looking out of the window, looking at the clouds wistfully, thinking about the world. No. I was noisy. Ellen had no friends, not even from the village school, which all of the Sadler children attended. Even at school, she seemed to prefer her own company. Ellen's whole family found this to be a bit odd. When they were all together as a family, she wasn't a talker. She wasn't chatty. She just kept herself to herself. So she gets to age 11. And at this point, Anne and husband Thomas, they are struggling to make ends meet. And they decide Ellen will have to go and get a job and try and help out with the household. So they send her to the neighbouring village to look for a nursemaid position. And she is successful in securing a job. And it starts well for Ellen. So she goes to work for a family who've got 2 young children. And at first, that's going fine. You know, she's going there every day. She's helping out with the kids. But it quickly starts to go downhill after just a month, when the woman that Ellen is working for finds her to be sleepy and too tired to work. So she starts to get frustrated by Ellen's lack of energy and focus, and she feels like the young girl is just too unenergetic for the job. So she lets her go. Now, poor Ellen, 11 years old, has to come home, tell Anne and tell Thomas that she no longer has that position. It's around about this time that Ellen starts to complain of headaches. And she's going through this phase of drowsiness and wanting to sleep all the time. So they did what they do in this time period. They called the local reverend, the Reverend Studholme. So the Reverend Studholme comes over to the home. He takes a look at Ellen. He talks with Anne and Thomas, what's going on. Okay, she's quite tired. She's saying she's got headaches. Now, he'd actually himself, as the sort of village reverend, he'd been concerned about Ellen from a distance. He'd been worried that she was so withdrawn and she was so not like other children. So he's hearing about her condition. He's concerned. But Anne and Thomas are saying, look, we're skint. We haven't got a pot to piss in, as the old saying goes. So we can't afford doctors and specialists. Like, we don't know what to do here. And the Reverend says, okay, I will speak to the hospital in the next town and see if I can have her admitted so that she can be checked over. Now, once in hospital, Ellen's condition worsens. She begins to have more headaches. She's drowsy, much more than she already was. And when a doctor examines her, looking for the cause, they find what they think is an abscess at the back of her neck, but they're not entirely sure that's what it is. Anne and Thomas, obviously, they're very worried. They've got 11 other kids to look after, so the whole thing is very stressful. Ellen would stay in hospital for 17 weeks. When she started to show little signs of improving, she was allowed to come home. Now, it's not unusual that at this time there were people with strange symptoms and things going on, and maybe they didn't have all the medical answers for what might be afflicting that person. Perhaps, they didn't. But I think the fact that she was in hospital for that length of time was alarming. And also, I mean, I hate to keep harping on about this, but the fact that she just was what people described as quite a curious child made things seem like it was weirder. I don't know. What happens next is the really strange part of the story. Ellen returns from the hospital in a rickety horse and cart and she's put to bed by her mother Anne, and then she goes to sleep. Ellen would sleep for the next 9 years. Yes, indeedio, you heard that correctly. She was asleep for 9 years. So of course, when she comes home from the hospital, she goes to sleep and she doesn't wake up the next day, her mother and Thomas immediately assume that she's dead. But here is the thing. Her heart is beating, her pulse is strong, and she's breathing. So, I mean, they're terrified. They're of course convinced she's about to die. Doctors are called at this point. The Reverend comes back, expecting that he's about to have the death of a child on his hands. But not the case. She's very much alive. She's just asleep. She is the real life Sleeping Beauty. And it is absolutely baffling. So, completely confused and not really sure what they should do, her family simply carry on as best they can while Ellen is asleep all day in bed. Her mother Anne gives up most of her work, most of her duties. The oldest children take on the running of the house, and Anne spends most of her time at Ellen's bedside. Now, it doesn't take long for nosy neighbours, concerned relatives, and, well, I guess people just wanting to stick their beak in to come knocking on the door and asking if there's anything that they can do. But really what they want to see is the sleeping Ellen. Now, at first, Anne and Thomas are very protective of her. They won't let anyone into the bedroom. Instead, they say, look, she's just sleeping and there is nothing to see. Now, if we know anything in life, anything at all, it is this. The minute you tell people there is nothing to see, they immediately assume there's something to see. And curiosity gets the better of them. It's about a month into her sleeping when one of the locals in the village contacts a newspaper, hoping that the newspaper, the journalist from the newspaper will come, report on it, and perhaps they might get a picture of this girl sleeping in bed. They might get a bit more of the story, because locals are frustrated. They're going and they're knocking on Anne and Thomas's door, but they're not getting what they want. They're not being told what's going on. I mean, I'm saying, right, these people are nosy. I would have been doing the exact same thing. I would probably have been that villager who called the newspapers just because I would have wanted to know what the hell's going on. Now, Anne is not impressed at all at this intrusion. And Thomas is really grumpy that his house is now becoming a place for villagers to pop in willy bloody nilly. Everybody's just popping by. So the first journalist comes, and When Anne is asked what happened, she recounts the story of how Ellen returned from the hospital, went to sleep, and didn't wake up, but is alive. Short and sweet. She keeps it nice and simple. That's the story. So the journalist is allowed in to visit Ellen, to see her. Visits, and then goes away and writes this. Her breathing was regular and natural. The skin soft and the body warm. She is a healthy subject. The pulse is rather fast. The hands were small and thin, but the fingers quite flexible. The body emaciated. The feet and the legs like those of a dead child, almost ice cold. Her features are pleasant, more so than might be expected under these circumstances. Her eyes, her cheeks are sunken, and there's no colour on her cheeks. The paleness was not that heavy dew which betokens death. Now, the story that the journalist was telling here was quite factual, but it carries something in the wording that just creates this air of doubt. There's definitely some kind of question mark in the article, as if something's just not quite right here. There's something a bit off, something a bit weird. So the story runs with the headline, one of the most astounding, inexplicable physiological phenomena ever known. So, what's a headline like that going to do? Well, it's going to bring lots of people. Anne and Thomas, frustrated with now the hundreds of people who want to get into the cottage, who want to see the sleeping girl, realise something. They could actually make some money out of this if they wanted. And they really did want to. They had to. They were such a poor family. So they started to charge people for visiting the house to catch a glimpse of the sleeping girl. By now it had been 2 years since Ellen went to sleep. Of course, knowing that you only need to pay a little $1 at the door, people are queuing up to come and visit the cottage. The cottage actually gets its own nickname. It becomes Sleepy Cottage in the press. So Anne's at the door, charging people to cross the threshold, come in, and to see Ellen. And after a few weeks, they are beginning to make some pretty good cash out of this, because the story is now spreading through the UK and it's gaining lots of interest. Now, if there's something else that we can agree on, it's this. People are weird, aren't they? Let's just all agree that people are fucking weird. Some of the visitors who would come to see Ellen, this is what they would do. They would conceal little sharp objects on them, like tiny little knives or needles, tiny little things that nobody could see, and they would jab Ellen with them when Anne wasn't looking, just to make sure she was asleep. Can you imagine? You've travelled, right? The whole thing's crazy. So you would travel a distance to see an 11-year-old girl asleep in a bed, and you would think, do you know what I must do? I must tuck a small knife into the cuff of my shirt so that when her mum's not looking, I can jab her and try and get her to wake up. I mean, honestly. So, Anne and Thomas, realizing this is what people are doing, they were not happy about this, not happy one little bit. So they had to then start checking people before they came into the bedroom to visit Ellen. Are you carrying any knives? Are you carrying any weapons? I mean, honestly, the Sleepy Cottage has turned into airport security at this point. Outrageous. The other thing that people wanted was Ellen's hair. So Anne and Thomas were like, again, we could make a little money out of this. So people would pay handsomely for Anne to cut a lock of hair off of Ellen's sleeping head and take it away as a souvenir. Obviously, that was short-lived because Ellen was just going to run out of hair entirely. Now, what of Ellen? I bet you've got questions. I did. Definitely had questions. How is she staying alive? What about just the very basic humanness of it? Well, 2.5 years into her sleep, doctors said she's showing signs of starvation. Now, she is being fed through a sort of straw coming out of a teapot. It's this sort of homemade situation that Anne's got going on. And it's like sugar water she's feeding her. Sorry, I got slightly distracted when I thought about sugar water because I once remembered that I brought a bee back to life by giving it sugar water. I've just remembered that. Oh my God, I am literally like a saint. My God, my work for the bee community is outstanding. I should be given some kind of award for that. So she's getting this sort of sugar water through the straw. Now, what about her other human functions? Well, Anne said these were normal and they were taken care of. So everything about Ellen in the bed is sort of working, like everything. It's all working. She's just not awake. So, like every good story, there has to be another opinion, another school of thought, and plenty of people had questions regarding her ability to stay alive whilst asleep. You know, people said surely the liquids she's receiving cannot be enough to keep her going. And so skepticism begins to grow. In a way, that's kind of what the sneaking in of those sharp objects was. It was people being sure this is some kind of a hoax. This is a confidence trick the family have designed to earn some money. But Anne and Thomas, of course, they deny this. What doesn't help that feeling of suspicion is that one day a doctor from out of town drops in unexpectedly to visit Ellen and, see for himself what this whole situation is about. But he arrives unannounced. Anne isn't ready, and Anne says, you can't come in just now. I need time to go and get Ellen ready. What does that mean? What does it mean? Now, that could be perfectly innocent. She just might mean, there's things around the bed and the bedroom needs a bit tidied, or, it could be anything or anything at all. But when the doctor reports to newspapers that the mother had said, I need to get her ready, that, of course, sent those gossip mongers, those doubters, into a spin because they, at this point, were like, aha, we knew it wasn't true. Then, after this, very quickly, sightings of Ellen begin to appear. Someone said she had been seen walking round the graveyards at night and she was just fine and dandy. Others said that they saw her daily sitting by the window looking out, not asleep at all. And of course, what adds to that fact is that people say, look, if she's not starved to death by yet, somehow she is eating. She's waking up and she's eating. She's got to be. And they're faking this whole thing. They say, of course, no, we're not. Remember the reverend that I mentioned, the Reverend Studholme, who was the dude that basically put her in the hospital the first time round? He is really suspicious of Anne and Thomas. In fact, he keeps popping round the cottage unannounced just to see if he could catch them out. I kind of love this image of like this reverend just like walking up to the cottage, just knocking on the door at any moment, hoping that he's going to catch something out. Other factors which led in a change of opinion on the story was that 3 years after Ellen had been asleep, Anne was allowed the opportunity to move her daughter to a hospital where she could be cared for, because the story was big, and so this hospital said, look, this is obviously something very, very strange. We will take her, we will give her a hospital bed and we will care for her here. Anne adamantly refused to have her daughter moved. And people said, of course, she doesn't want her daughter moved. She's making, what would be the modern day equivalent of £200 per week from visitors. Why on earth would she move her gold mine? Anne said, nope, it's nothing to do with that. It's simply that I want her at home. Anne's story of how Ellen fell into this great long sleep also altered over time. And although she initially said that Ellen came home from the hospital, went to sleep and just didn't wake up, she later told a more embellished version of the story to the newspapers that involved her and Ellen praying. She said Ellen began to convulse and fell down as if dead. It was just a much more dramatic version of events. And of course, your super sleuths were there going, well, that's not what you said 3 years ago. Again, I count myself among that. I would be one of those people going, Anne, that's not what you said. You're changing your story. Of course, doctors are still attending. Sleepy Cottage is now an attraction for foreign visitors travelling from overseas to see the girl who has been asleep for years. The Prince of Wales, the future King Edward V11. I don't know what V11 means. 7? 9? 12? Whoever. One of the kings. Whoever was king at that time. King Edward. He comes to visit Ellen. He comes in to where she is asleep and he lays his hands on her, hoping that this might awake her from her sleep. Like in the old days when they used to do that kind of thing. Just quick, just put your hands on him. That'll wake him up. Nah, it didn't. So as the story gets more and more coverage, the doubting gets louder, and then the law gets involved. I mean, I suppose that's in the way that the law would get involved if any child was sick and there was believed to be suspicious circumstances. The local magistrate and the Home Secretary, they become involved in the story. And the first thing that they do is they send in a doctor and they ask this doctor to report back to them. And the doctor says this: There is flesh on the cheeks. Her eyes are calmly closed as though in healthy sleep. I ventured to raise one of the lids and to touch the eye beneath, but there was not even a quivering of the eyelash. The girl's hands are warm. The fingers are not in the least stiffened. This is not a skeletal hand. Neither is the girl's limbs emaciated, as you would imagine under these extraordinary circumstances. The child's body is thin, however, and she is ice cold, but not emaciated. As for her breathing, it's feeble, almost impossible to detect, but it is there. So, realizing that ultimately the law couldn't really do anything here, the magistrate and the Home Secretary, they sort of have to turn around and say, well, we've kind of done our part. There's nothing we can really do here. And, it wasn't all doubt. Anne and Thomas did have people who defended them and said, look, they just want their daughter to wake up as much as anyone does. So at 8 years on, 8 long, bloody years since she fell asleep, Ellen is now 19 years old. She went to bed as an 11-year-old and she's now 19. Her mother, Anne, dies suddenly in Sleepy Cottage. Anne had been bringing in something from the back garden, and as she came into the kitchen, she suffered a massive heart attack and died. Anne's death was quite the plot twist, as people now went, aha, we'll get the truth. The truth is going to come out because Anne has been the puppet master of this whole tale. So, now that she's gone, we'll get the real story. So there is an inquest held in the local pub. I love that. And we're going to have an inquest into this major story. We're going to involve doctors, lawyers, the public, the family. Where should we have it? Local pub? Yeah, sure. Sounds great. At the inquest, Thomas was questioned repeatedly about Ellen's sleep and about how she was fed and about the sightings of her near the window and Anne's role and the money and all of this. And he kind of refuses to answer any questions. He's adamant it is the truth. And he's saying, look, the passing of my wife Anne is not a chance for you to discover that this has been a hoax. It's not. The Reverend Studholme, he's there, of course, as the biggest sceptic of them all. There's kind of no real outcome to the inquest other than the question of where should Ellen go? Should she stay at home? What should happen? And it's decided that the 2 oldest children in the family will now look after Ellen. So that's what happens. The 2 older siblings settle in to look after her. 5 months to the day after her mother died, Ellen Sadler opens her eyes. She's now 20 years old and she's awake. She sits up in bed and asks, what's going on? It's explained to her that she's been asleep for 9 years. The only really noticeable impact on Ellen's body is a slightly weak left eye. Otherwise, she's in perfect health. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if you woke up and someone said, do you know you've been asleep for 9 years? You'd be like, what the fuck is going on? So, I mean, almost the weirdest thing here is that life just goes back to normal. Well, I mean, not normal. You can imagine the absolute ruckus that's caused by her waking up. But yeah, I mean, essentially, things go back to normal. 5 years after waking up, Ellen gets married. She gets a cottage in Turnville. She ends up having 5 children of her own. And as she goes on, just living her life, people are still clamouring to want to talk to her, interview her, write stories about her. I mean, Ellen's story has been examined about 1,000,000 times for signs of witchcraft, and it's been called one of the strangest hoaxes ever created. But Ellen says there's no hoax, there's no witchcraft involved. This just is what happened. Sleepy Cottage. It remains this place of great interest. And interestingly, just in case you're in the market for a new house and can't afford the £75 million that it is now, you could buy it. But for a long time, it wasn't a home for anyone to live in. Instead, it was used for TV. If anyone knows the fantastic British comedy, The Vicar of Dibley, with Dawn French, the cottage she lives in The Vicar of Dibley, is Sleepy Cottage. Also, the cottage was used in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, one of the best films ever made, and the TV programme Killing Eve, which I've never seen but heard is good. So, Ellen lives on to a ripe old age of 75. She has grandchildren, and these grandchildren would hear tale of their grandmother, the sleeping girl. She lived for the rest of her life without headaches or sleep problems. And so ends the story of the sleeping girl. Okay then. Strange. Well, that was that. That's that weird story. Yeah, I like that one. Caught my attention. I don't know. Is it a hoax? Is it not a hoax? Who knows? There's a few of these kind of stories of that time, I think, that are a bit like that. So, interesting. Okay. Well, anyway, as I said, be sure to get your Valentine's cards sent promptly. Get them sent on time, and I look forward to receiving them. And I hope you're well. And until we speak again, okay, goodbye.
It didn't affect me really one way or the other. I would imagine from the look on his face. Let's get it on. Let's do it. Let's get it over. Let's get it on. Let's do it. Let's get it over.